The cracked leather of the instructor's seat had become an unexpected comfort, molded by years of drivers gripping the wheel too tightly, nervous hands tapping anxiously against the dashboard. At 38, I had long since stopped expecting surprises in my day-to-day routine. Teaching students how to navigate city streets, parallel park, and merge onto highways wasn't exactly the career I'd envisioned for myself, but after a slow, painful decline from a managerial position in the automotive industry, it was the reality I had settled into. I had told myself it was temporary, just until I figured things out. But years had passed, and now, this was my life. Most students blended together. Some were overly cautious, some too reckless. A few had natural talent, while others made me fear for my life every time they touched the accelerator. It was all routine. Predictable. And then there was him. The first time I saw Elliot's name on my schedule, I barely glanced at it. Just another student. Just another hour. But when he walked up to the car, something flickered at the edge of my awareness, something unusual. He was young. Fresh in a way that made me acutely aware of my own years. Blonde hair, slightly tousled, like he had either just gotten out of bed or ruffled it up on purpose. His eyes were green, sharp, but filled with a restless energy, like he had too many thoughts at once and no clear direction for them. He flashed a lopsided grin as he reached for the passenger door. "Sure, right? You're my instructor?" "Just sure," I corrected, nodding toward the driver's seat. "Let's see what we're working with." Elliot slid into the seat, adjusting his posture quickly, as if he wanted to impress me. He gripped the wheel, fingers flexing slightly against the textured surface, before exhaling through his nose. "Nervous?" I asked, watching his hands rather than his face. More like anticipating disaster. He smirked. "I already crashed my mom's car once. So, setting the bar low." I raised an eyebrow. "Well, let's try to avoid repeating history." The first lesson was what I expected: hesitant starts, too fast turns, stopping a little too hard at red lights. But he listened. He adjusted. He caught on quicker than most. And he paid attention to me, and not just to my words, but the way I said them, my tone, my reactions. There was something about the way he would glance at me when he thought I wasn't looking, a flicker of curiosity, something questioning, something unreadable. By the end of the lesson, as we pulled back into the lot, he leaned back in his seat, exhaling dramatically. "Well, no one died. I'd call that a win." "Barely," I said dryly, making him laugh. It was a laugh that stayed with me longer than it should have. As he stepped out of the car, our arms brushed, just lightly, just enough to feel the warmth of him for half a second. I told myself I imagined the way he hesitated before pulling away. I told myself it didn't mean anything. But something about this lesson didn't fade into the background like all the others. And somehow, I already knew I'd be seeing a lot more of Elliot F. The second lesson started much the same as the first. Elliot slid into the driver's seat with that same half-smirk, tapping his fingers against the wheel as I adjusted my seatbelt. "All right," I said, scanning my notes. "Let's work on smoother stops today." Elliot groaned. "Let me guess, you're still traumatized from the last lesson?" "Let's just say my neck still remembers it." He laughed, the sound effortless, and I had to remind myself to stay professional. We pulled out of the lot, and I found myself watching him as he navigated the streets, his fingers flexing against the wheel, the way his jaw tightened slightly when he focused. There was something about his presence, the way he carried himself, that made me more aware of the space between us. At a stoplight, he glanced at me and smirked. You never told me how long you've been doing this." "Too long." "Wow. Cryptic." I sighed, relenting. "Almost 8 years. Damn." He whistled. "That's a lot of panicked teenagers. You have no idea." His grin widened, and he made a dramatic show of straightening his posture. "Don't worry, sure. I'm gonna be your best student. You'll be bragging about my parking skills for years." "We'll see," I said, unimpressed. But I was amused. The lesson went on, smoother than the first. He still hesitated at intersections, still overcorrected on turns, but there was improvement. I watched the way he bit his lip when he concentrated, the slight furrow in his brow, the way he grumbled when he messed up a maneuver. At one point, I reached out to correct his grip on the wheel, my hand covering his for just a second before he adjusted, his fingers brushing mine as he moved. It was brief. But it was enough. His eyes flicked toward me, just for a second, before he looked back at the road. "You've got good instincts," I said, my voice steady. "Yeah?" He glanced at me again, something unreadable in his gaze. I nodded. "You just need to trust them more." He exhaled through his nose, almost like a laugh. "I could say the same to you." I frowned, thrown off by the comment. "What do you mean?" He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he pulled up to the curb, his hands resting lightly on the wheel, his fingers drumming once, twice. "I don't know." He shrugged. "You seem like someone who thinks too much. Like you second-guess yourself a lot." I was caught off guard by the accuracy of it. Elliot turned his head slightly, watching me out of the corner of his eye, his lips twitching into that familiar smirk. "See? You're doing it right now." I have to laugh, shaking my head. "Focus on driving, Elliot." Right, he said, throwing the car into gear. "Wouldn't want to traumatize your neck again." I should have left it at that. I should have ignored the way my chest felt too tight, the way the space between us seemed to shrink every time he looked at me like that. But as he turned the wheel, as his forearm brushed against mine again, I realized something I wasn't ready to admit. This wasn't just another lesson. And Elliot wasn't just another student. A week later, Elliot showed up for his lesson with a different energy. He wasn't bouncing his knee or making jokes right away. He slid into the seat, adjusting it slightly, his fingers lingering on the lever, his brows pulled together like he was somewhere else. I noticed. "Everything all right?" I asked as he put the car into drive. "Yeah." He hesitated. "I mean, kinda." I waited, letting him decide if he wanted to say more. He exhaled, gripping the wheel tighter than usual. "I just had a fight with my dad this morning." I glanced at him. "Bad one?" He nodded, his jaw tightening. "We don't see eye to eye on a lot of things." I didn't pry. But I didn't dismiss it either. "That sucks." He snorted, shaking his head. "Yeah. It does." The air between us felt different. Less light-hearted than usual. More personal. We drove in silence for a few blocks before he spoke again. "You ever feel like no matter what you do, some people will never take you seriously?" The question hit harder than he probably meant it to. I glanced at him, watching the way his fingers tightened around the wheel, his lips pressing together like he was holding something back. "Yeah," I admitted. "I know that feeling." Elliot turned his head slightly, his gaze flickering toward me. "Yeah?" I nodded. People like to put others into boxes. Sometimes, they don't realize how much they're limiting you. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You don't strike me as the type to let people limit you." I have to laugh, shaking my head. "You'd be surprised." For the rest of the lesson, something in our dynamic had shifted. He listened more carefully, but not just to my instructions, to my tone, my pauses, my hesitations. When I reached over to adjust his grip on the wheel, his fingers brushed mine again, but this time, neither of us moved away immediately. It was subtle. Barely a moment. But I felt it. And I knew he did too. It was his last lesson before his driving test. Elliot slid into the seat, but this time, he didn't start the car right away. His fingers tapped against the wheel, his brows slightly furrowed, like he was hesitating on something. "What's on your mind?" I asked. He let out a slow breath. This is gonna sound stupid, but he turned his head toward me, his green eyes unreadable. "I'm kinda gonna miss this." I swallowed. That was dangerous territory. I tried to keep my voice even. "You'll be driving on your own soon. You won't need an instructor anymore." "Yeah." He didn't sound entirely happy about that. I cleared my throat, motioning toward the road. "Come on, let's get started." He hesitated for another second before shifting into gear. The lesson was smooth. Too smooth. He was focused, precise, controlled, more than usual. It felt like he was holding something back. When we parked at the end, I turned to him. "You're ready? You'll do fine on the test." He didn't answer right away. Instead, he exhaled slowly, like he was making a decision. Then, he turned toward me fully, his fingers gripping the bottom of the wheel, his knuckles pale. "Sure." His voice was quieter now. "Steady. Can I ask you something?" I nodded. "Go ahead." He licked his lips, exhaling again, like he was bracing himself. Then, finally, "Have you felt it too?" My chest tightened. I knew exactly what he meant. I could feel the weight of his gaze, the way his hands flexed slightly on the wheel, like he was fighting the urge to reach out. This was the moment. The line I wasn't supposed to cross. But then he moved first. His fingers brushed against my forearm, just barely, but intentionally. Testing. I didn't move away. The air between us was thick, charged, impossible to ignore. He swallowed. "I know this is probably crazy. And I know it's probably not okay. But I don't care." I felt my pulse in my throat. "Elliot. Just say it," he whispered. "Tell me I'm imagining this." But I couldn't. Because he wasn't. He exhaled, looking down for a second before lifting his hand, slowly, hesitantly, toward my jaw. I let him. His fingers were warm, tentative but deliberate, as they rested against my skin. His thumb barely grazed my cheekbone, a light, testing stroke. I should have stopped him. But I didn't. Instead, I leaned in. Just a fraction. Just enough. His breath hitched, and I felt it, the shift, the point of no return. Then, softly, carefully, he asked, "Can I kiss you?" Every rational thought screamed at me to say no. To pull away. To stop this before it got any more complicated. But I didn't want to. So I whispered, "Yes." And then his lips were on mine. It was slow at first, a hesitant press, a question asked and answered in the same moment. His fingers tightened slightly against my jaw, pulling me closer. I felt the warmth of his breath, the way his lips curved slightly, like he was smiling into the kiss. I pulled him closer, just slightly, my hands finding his waist, steadying him. The gear shift dug into my side, but I didn't care. The kiss deepened, unrushed but certain, the tension finally breaking like a dam overflowing. When we finally pulled away, our breaths were uneven, the car too small, too warm, too filled with something unspoken. Elliot's pupils were dilated, his fingers still resting against my jaw. Well, he breathed. That was definitely not in the lesson plan. I huffed a quiet laugh, shaking my head. No. It wasn't. Silence stretched between us, but it wasn't awkward. It was heavy. Loaded with possibility. So, Elliot murmured, his thumb grazing my cheek one last time before pulling away, "What happens now?" I didn't have an answer. But I knew one thing for sure. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. I drove home that night with my hands tight around the steering wheel, my mind racing. It had happened. I had kissed Elliot. Or he had kissed me. Maybe it didn't matter. The point was, it happened, and now my carefully controlled world had shifted in a way I couldn't undo. It was reckless. Irresponsible. But the part that scared me the most? I didn't regret it. I should have. I should have spent the entire night convincing myself that it was a mistake, that I would never let it happen again. But every time I closed my eyes, I could still feel him, his fingers on my skin, the way he sighed against my lips, the warmth of his hands. I knew what I should do. I should put distance between us. I should end this before it started. So, for the next few days, I ignored his texts. Elliot, hey! Elliot, can we talk? Elliot, I feel like you're avoiding me. I stared at each one, my fingers hovering over the keyboard, but I didn't respond. It wasn't fair to him, but it was the only thing I knew how to do. Then, on the third day, my phone rang. Sarah. I hesitated before answering. Hey. Well, you sound like a man having a full-blown existential crisis. I sighed. It's complicated. Complicated? You're avoiding him, aren't you? I didn't answer. Sarah sighed heavily. Look, I'm not going to tell you what to do, but let's be real, you're not doing a great job of convincing yourself that you don't want this. I pinched the bridge of my nose. Sarah, he's 18. And you're what? 38? Not exactly ancient. It's not just the age gap, I muttered. I was his instructor. There's a power dynamic. It's over now, she cut in. He passed his test. You're not his instructor anymore. You're just two people who clearly want to be around each other. I swallowed hard. That doesn't mean it's right. She paused. Then, softer, maybe. But does it feel wrong? I didn't answer. Because we both knew the truth. On the fourth day, I gave in. I sent a single text. Me, coffee? His response was almost instant. Elliot, yes. When and where? We met at a small, quiet cafe, far from the driving school, far from anywhere we might run into people we knew. When he walked in, something hit me square in the chest. He wasn't a student anymore. He was just Elliot. And I was just sure. His eyes found mine immediately, his lips twitching into that familiar smirk, but there was something else behind it. Something uncertain. I had expected him to be angry. I had expected hurt, frustration, maybe even a cold shoulder. But instead, he just pulled out the chair across from me and sat down, like this was the most normal thing in the world. Hey, he said simply. Hey. He stirred his coffee, watching me carefully. So. You ghosted me. I sighed. Yeah. Wanna tell me why? I met his gaze. Because I needed to figure out if I was making a mistake. He raised an eyebrow. And? I exhaled slowly, rubbing my jaw. I don't know. Elliot set his spoon down, his expression unreadable. That's a terrible answer, sure. I let out a half laugh, shaking my head. I know. Silence stretched between us, but it wasn't awkward. It was heavy. Full of something unspoken. He leaned forward slightly, resting his elbows on the table. Let me make this easy for you. I braced myself. I'm not an idiot, he said. I know this isn't simple. And I know you're probably overthinking every possible way this could go wrong. I didn't deny it. But here's the thing, he tilted his head, studying me. I don't care about easy. I don't care about what other people think. I just know that for the past few weeks, every time I got in that car with you, it was the best part of my day." I swallowed hard. "I know you feel it too," he added softly. I let out a slow breath. "Elliot." He reached across the table, his fingers grazing mine, barely there. "Testing." I didn't pull away. He smiled, small, knowing, hopeful. "I don't need you to have everything figured out right now," he murmured. "I just need to know if you're willing to try." My pulse hammered in my throat. I turned my hand over beneath his, fingers intertwining slowly, deliberately. And for the first time in a long time, I let myself stop thinking. I let myself say yes. A week later, Elliot passed his driving test. And 2 weeks after that, we weren't instructor and student anymore. We were just Shaw and Elliot. And that made all the difference.